My name is Mark, and for nearly 10 years, I've worked as a police officer in a quiet town on the outskirts of Illinois. Night shifts had shown me the strange and the mundane. Rustling leaves, creaking doors, the occasional arrest that disrupted the silence. But that night was different. It was as if the very air thickened with a presence that defied explanation. The cold wind swept through the streets, scattering dry leaves that scraped against the asphalt. And inside the station, the glow of the computer screen cast harsh shadows against the walls. My partner, John, was outside on patrol, leaving me alone in the dimly lit administrative office. The stillness was profound, interrupted only by the ticking of the wall clock that seemed almost exaggerated in the quiet. My fingers tapped the keyboard as I struggled through another set of reports, when a noise caught my attention. Soft, shifting, something between shuffling footsteps and a whisper. I tensed, hoping it was just the wind, some branch brushing against the windows. But the sound persisted, steady, rhythmic, as though pacing itself to my heartbeat. A chill needled down my spine as I reached for the flashlight. By day, the station felt ordinary, even dull. But under the muted glow of a single lamp, it turned malevolent, each shadow twisting like it hid secrets. I walked slowly, each step a reluctant echo on the tiled floor, pulling me further into the corridor leading to the cells. The noise sharpened, morphing into uneven footfalls. The oddity was undeniable. All cells had been empty for days. There should have been nothing. No one. I approached the first cell, peering into the black void beyond the bars. My flashlight carved out slices of the room, revealing cracked brick and emptiness. I moved forward, each step accompanied by a feeling that crept beneath my skin. The sounds faltered, a hesitant pause, as if whatever was there had become aware of me. I swallowed, gripping the baton at my waist, my fingers stiff from the cold dread settling into my bones. The final cell loomed at the end of the hallway, a smothering quiet pressing against my ears. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. The screech of metal cut through the silence, vibrating in the stale air. The beam of my flashlight danced erratically over the walls. They were blank, cold, and indifferent. But the air felt charged, weighted as though an unseen gaze pinned me in place. Then I saw it. Shadows shifting with a will of their own, coiling like smoke, twisting into forms that suggested something trying to speak without words. My pulse pounded, each beat reverberating in my ears as the darkness around me breathed. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint and drawn out, brushing against the cell walls like dry leaves in the wind. The voice, unearthly and wavering, strung together words I couldn't quite grasp. A shiver coiled through me, my mind scrambling for explanations. There's no one here, I tried to convince myself, but the dense, suffocating sense of presence was undeniable. The whispers grew louder, layered with countless murmurs, and one word seemed to pierce through the noise. Justice. Instinct urged me to leave, and I pivoted sharply toward the door. Before I could reach it, a metallic bang reverberated as it slammed shut, making me jump. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge, as if an unseen hand held it in place. Panic surged. My flashlight quivered, casting shaky beams that played tricks on my eyes. The shadows writhed faster now, their shapes morphing into grotesque figures that seemed to stare back at me. A breath caught in my chest as a dark mass began to form in one corner of the cell. It shifted, gathering substance until it resembled a human silhouette built of shadows and blurred edges. The voice, clearer now, repeated a chilling phrase: "There is no peace without justice." Each word thrummed in the air, pressing down on me like a crushing weight. I was trapped, caught between fleeing and freezing. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway. "Mark, what's happening?" John's voice was a lifeline, strained with urgency. He gripped the handle and with a forceful yank managed to pull the door open. I stumbled out, the hallway's cold air washing over me in a wave of relief. My pulse hammered as I tried to find words. John's eyes searched mine, caught between confusion and concern. "Are you all right? What happened in there?" I swallowed hard, the words sticking in my throat. "There's something in that cell, John. Something not human." My voice quivered, raw and uncertain. The look I gave him must have conveyed the truth, because his expression shifted from skepticism to wary belief. With shared trepidation, we turned back to the cell. John's flashlight sliced through the dark as we both held our breath. In the farthest corner, a subtle flicker caught our attention. The shadow was still there, but weaker, almost as if waiting. John's jaw tightened. "We need to find out what happened here," he said, voice low. The thought chilled me. A spirit, trapped and restless, seeking retribution for an injustice long buried. Back in the dimly lit administrative office, we sifted through dusty, forgotten files. Hours passed as we leafed through yellowed pages and brittle reports. Finally, we found it. The name Edward Barnes. 30 years ago, he had been wrongfully imprisoned, accused of a crime he didn't commit. His time in the cell was marked by mistreatment, ending with his death under mysterious circumstances just before his release. The case was buried, hushed up, and those responsible walked free. The room seemed to close in around us as we pieced together the truth. A man, broken and seeking justice, had never truly left. The connection was undeniable. The cell I had stepped into was where Edward Barnes had spent his last tormented days. The restless presence now made perfect sense. John and I shared a grim glance, an unspoken understanding passing between us. We had to do something to lay Edward's spirit to rest. With no real experience in confronting the supernatural, we resorted to simple, sincere measures: candles, incense, and words that came from the heart. It was a humble plan, fueled by hope that acknowledgement would bring Edward peace. We returned to the cell, hands trembling as we set the candles down and lit them one by one. The flickering light carved wavering shadows onto the walls, and the air thickened around us, heavy with anticipation. Edward was there, waiting. The incense smoke spiraled upward, curling like ghostly fingers and spreading a scent that made the stifling atmosphere slightly more bearable. John's voice broke the tense silence, rough but resolute. "Edward Barnes, we know you're here. We recognize the wrong done to you, and we ask for forgiveness on behalf of those who failed you." The restless shadows slowed, their frenzied dance calming into something that felt almost mournful. The dark figure, once menacing, softened, its edges dissolving as if absorbing the words. The air shifted, an unexplainable current moving through the room, and for the first time that night, The whispers fell silent. The room grew quieter, the tension unwinding into a profound, almost peaceful stillness. Edward's shadow thinned, wavering for a moment before disappearing entirely. A weight lifted from my chest, and a strange calm settled over the cell. We stood in place, breathing deeply as the quiet enveloped us. It felt surreal, as though the entire station had taken a deep breath and exhaled. John's eyes met mine, and the faint curve of a relieved smile appeared. "I think we did it, Mark," he said, voice hushed as if afraid to break the moment. The station was different now. The air felt lighter, no longer charged with an unseen burden. We lingered for a few moments, letting the reality of what we'd just experienced sink in. The cell that once felt like a cage of dark memories now felt at peace, as if its story had finally reached a conclusion. Back in the administrative office, we documented everything. The whispers, the shifting shadows, Edward's final moments. We knew some colleagues might doubt the account, might roll their eyes at ghost stories on paper, but we wanted to leave a record, a warning, so that if anyone else found themselves hearing those whispered echoes, they'd know the truth and understand the reason behind them. As dawn began to seep into the sky, painting it with pale light, I stepped outside, the chill of morning air wrapping around me like an embrace. One thought lingered as I watched the horizon. The world is full of stories that challenge reason, but with respect and compassion, even the most tormented souls can find rest. John glanced at me, a knowing look exchanged between us before we turned and made our way home. Realizing that what we'd done that night was more than just part of the job. It was something profoundly human. They always say that the strangest things happen when you least expect them. I never really took that seriously until that night. I'd been a cop in southern New Jersey for over a decade, and most nights were spent handling the usual: noise complaints, shoplifting, petty neighbor disputes. Nothing that stuck with you. But that night, the graveyard shift, was different. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. It was the kind of silence that made you start imagining things. I was driving down an empty road, the kind that stretches on forever, with dense trees on both sides. No lights, no houses. Just me, my patrol car, and the hum of the engine filling the void. Then out of nowhere, I saw it. A car parked on the grass beside the road, the driver's door wide open. It was at an odd angle, like it had been shoved off the road on purpose. I pulled over immediately, my instincts kicking in. I grabbed my vest and got out of the car. As I approached, I saw a figure step out of the car. They were slim, dressed in dark clothing, their movements swift but strange. They hesitated for a second before running into the forest. I couldn't decide what was stranger, that they ran into the woods at all, or how they moved, desperate, but almost calculated, like they knew exactly what they were doing. I stood there for a few seconds, weighing my options. Something wasn't right. I radioed in about a suspicious vehicle and stepped closer, flashlight in hand. As I got closer to the car, a smell hit me. Strong, rancid, and unmistakable. It was like dead animals, but sharper. It made my stomach churn. I shined my flashlight inside. There was no one in the car, but the driver's seat was reclined, and several tissues lay scattered on the passenger floor. stained with what looked like dried blood. On the back seat, there were bloody towels. That feeling in my gut twisted even tighter. Then I heard it. A noise from the woods. Footsteps, quick and light, as if someone was trying to move without making a sound. My hand shot to my holster. My flashlight followed the sound, and I shouted, "Police! Come out now! Hands where I can see them!" The noise stopped. My heart thundered in my chest, and every muscle tensed. I waited. Breath caught in my throat. Nothing. Then I heard a voice. It was low and drawn out, almost guttural. The strangest part? I couldn't understand a word. It sounded like another language, but slow, dragged out in a way that sent a chill through me. I repeated my command, louder this time, but the only response was silence. I turned back to the car, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I had to stay focused. I decided to check the interior again before making any rash moves. The towels in the back seat were soaked in blood, and something heavy was wrapped inside them. With shaking hands, I carefully peeled it back with my gloves. And that's when I saw it, a human hand, my breath caught in my throat. I stared at it for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was crimson, slick with fresh blood. I almost lost it. After all the years on the force, you think you've seen it all. But this was different. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. I immediately called it in, requesting backup and an ambulance, my voice tight with urgency. "We've got signs of a potential homicide. I need help now." My hands were sweating, but I kept my flashlight trained on the woods. I knew someone was still out there. While waiting for backup, the silence of the forest was shattered by more footsteps. This time, they were faster, moving away from me, deeper into the trees. My heart raced, and without thinking, I ran a few yards into the woods, flashlight sweeping through the darkness. But I saw nothing. I stopped, trying to focus, listening for any sounds other than the wind rustling the leaves. "Police! Come out now!" I shouted, my voice straining against the heavy stillness. No response, and then I noticed something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There were no blood trails, not near the car, not leading into the woods, not even a drop on the grass beside the vehicle. How was that possible? A severed hand, bloody towels, and no blood. It felt like the pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit, like everything had been deliberately staged. Why? I didn't know. But my instinct screamed at me not to venture deeper alone. I backed away from the trees, my breath shaky, and waited for my colleagues. Minutes later, patrol lights flickered down the road, and backup arrived in force. At least 4 officers, all moving quickly and decisively. I explained what I had found, describing the figure I had seen running into the woods, the eerie silence, and the blood-soaked car. When I revealed the severed hand wrapped in the towels, the shock was palpable. None of us had expected to deal with something like this, especially not on a quiet night like this. We called in the K9 unit and began organizing a wider search. I stood at the tree line with another officer, watching the dogs sniffing the air and our colleagues combing the area with high-powered flashlights. The search dragged on, but despite the thorough effort, no one found anything. It was as if the person I had seen vanish had never been there at all. Meanwhile, we turned our attention back to the car. The first thing we noticed, there were no plates. It seemed abandoned, but the engine was still warm. We searched the vehicle, but there was nothing inside that could identify the owner. No personal effects, no ID, nothing. It made the whole situation even stranger. There was a severed hand wrapped in bloody towels, but no sign of how the injury had occurred. There should have been a blood trail, something to tell us how the hand ended up in the car. But there was nothing. Just a pristine, calculated scene that led nowhere. We spent hours combing the woods, expanding the perimeter, and shining lights into every dark corner. But it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The K9 unit couldn't pick up any scent beyond the car itself, which added to the confusion. The forest felt still, almost as if it was holding its breath along with us. By 4 a.m., we had no choice but to call off the search. The eerie, unfinished feeling lingered in the air. It was as if we had been chasing something that wasn't even there, something that had vanished into thin air. I returned to my patrol car, my chest heavy with a sense of unease. The air felt thick, like the forest itself was watching, waiting. After everything was documented, the car was towed to the station for a more detailed analysis. We soon learned it had been stolen from a nearby town, but the owner had no clue who could have taken it. Their description didn't match the figure I had seen running into the woods. Then came the DNA test on the severed hand. No matches. Not in any database. It was as though it had never belonged to anyone at all. The case quickly went cold. No leads. No suspects. Nothing. All we had were the car, the hand, and the unsettling feeling that something, someone, was out there, playing a game we could never hope to understand. Even after the case was filed away, that night never left my mind. Too many unanswered questions lingered, none of them making any sense. Who was the person I saw running into the woods? Why did they flee like that, without a sound, without a trace? How did the severed hand end up in that car? And why wasn't there any blood trail? The blood-stained tissues and towels, scattered in the car, like they were placed to confuse us, gnawed at me. For weeks, I replayed every detail, trying to piece it together. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. It was like trying to force mismatched pieces into a puzzle, each one more disjointed than the last. My colleagues couldn't even look me in the eye when the topic came up. It wasn't just a mystery. It was as if something deeply wrong had happened, something none of us could explain. We were all uncomfortable. It was more than just a case. It was a feeling, something that crawled under your skin and settled there, just out of reach, like a shadow that never quite left. Since that night, the graveyard shift has never been the same. I was always skeptical of strange stories, dismissive of the kind of wild tales people told to spice up their lives. But now, every rustling in the woods, every abandoned car sitting silently on the side of the road, makes my stomach tighten with anxiety. I don't know what happened that night, and I probably never will. It all started and ended so quickly, so abruptly, that it almost felt surreal, like a bad dream. But it wasn't. I was there. I saw it. I felt it. And to this day, when I think about the smell, that sharp, suffocating scent, the severed hand wrapped in blood-soaked towels, and that low, eerie voice echoing through the trees, I can feel the same chill in my bones. It's the kind of chill that doesn't fade. It clings to you, like it knows something you don't. Sometimes, I wonder if whoever, or whatever, was out there is still waiting. Waiting for the next person, the next fool, who might get too close. I've been working the night shift at the sheriff's department in Bergen County for 2 years. Until that night, I didn't have any stories that kept me awake, just the usual drug arrests or late-night break-ins. But everything changed when the call came in. A scream had been reported from a house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and anything out of the ordinary draws eyes. Usually, these calls turned out to be a domestic dispute or someone having one too many. But as I turned onto that silent street, the way the shadows of the trees moved under the moonlight set me on edge. When I parked in front of the address, I double-checked it, convinced there'd been some mistake. The house stood dark and still, the only sign of life being a blue Toyota Sienna parked in the driveway. I approached and knocked, the sound echoing into the quiet, almost unnaturally loud. Just as I was about to knock again, a man stepped out from the porch next door, hesitant. He admitted he'd made the call and said, voice shaky, that the woman who lived there alone had screamed, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. The front door was locked. My pulse quickened as I circled the house, testing windows. Each one was securely shut, except for one at the back, slightly ajar, wide enough for someone to slip through. My chest tightened, and a prickle of unease crawled up my neck. I radioed for backup and got a confirmation, but the air felt too thick with urgency to wait. I climbed through the window, my boots landing with a muted thud on the kitchen floor. Each step creaked as I moved through the kitchen and living room, flipping on lights that cast harsh, flickering glows to chase the shifting shadows. "Police!" I called out, trying to sound composed. Silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. I checked every corner of the first floor, finding nothing out of place. But when I looked at the staircase, a wave of dread rolled over me. I unlocked the front door for the backup and started up the stairs, one slow, deliberate step at a time, each one matched by the pounding of my heart. At the top, 4 doors lined the hallway. I turned on the light, and the stillness was broken by the soft creak of one door moving. I swallowed hard, my instincts pulling me toward it. The doorknob felt cold and heavy in my grip. For a fleeting second, I considered waiting for backup. But the thought of someone needing help pushed me forward. I swung the door open and found myself staring at a bedroom. The thin light from the hallway cast long, trembling shadows across the room. A figure lay on the bed, covered up to the shoulders. I stepped closer, every sense on high alert. The woman's head was turned away from me, hair tangled on the pillow. My gaze dropped, and my stomach twisted violently as I saw dark, spreading stains marring the opposite side of the sheet. The realization hit like a blow, freezing me in place as the room seemed to shrink around me, suffocating in its silence. I yanked the sheet back, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood filled my nostrils. The woman lay there, battered and covered in wounds, her chest barely rising with shallow, ragged breaths. My hands shook as I radioed in, voice cracking with urgency. "Officer needs immediate backup and an ambulance now." The room's heavy silence pressed in tighter, more threatening. The creak I'd heard earlier replayed in my mind. It didn't fit with her unmoving state. I scanned the room. The dresser. the shadows stretching across the walls. My eyes settled on the closet in the corner, dark and half open. My heart pounded as I inched forward, gun at the ready, my hand hovering over the handle. 1, 2, 3. I yanked it open. Empty. Relief mingled with confusion until a realization hit me like ice water. Under the bed, I dropped to one knee and carefully lifted the bedskirt. My breath caught in my throat. Just inches from my face, eyes locked onto mine, a man stared back, his pupils wide and glistening with a mix of fear and something else, something unsettling. A mask covered the lower half of his face, but the intensity in his eyes screamed readiness. "Show me your hands," I shouted, my voice taut with adrenaline. His hands rose slowly, fingers trembling. The room was frozen in time as he slithered out, each move painfully deliberate. I kept my gun trained on him, every muscle taut, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. "Hands up. Move to the corner now," I barked, stepping back to maintain distance. The silence reclaimed the room, broken only by the heavy thump of my pulse echoing in my ears. The seconds stretched like hours until the hurried footsteps and familiar calls of backup officers on the stairs shattered the tension. The moment they entered, a wave of relief washed over me, loosening the iron grip of fear that had wrapped around my chest. With help now in the room, we secured the man, cuffing him as he stood motionless, resigned. My colleagues took control, and I stepped back, breath shuddering as the reality sank in. The woman's shallow breathing was checked, her condition critical but stable enough for transport. The blood soaked the bed, trickling in thin, slow drips that pattered to the floor, a reminder of how close death had come. As paramedics arrived and worked swiftly to take her away, a cold shiver of relief swept through me. She was alive, but hanging by a thread. The man, now being led out in handcuffs, met my gaze. His eyes, hollow and empty, offered no answers, no hint of remorse, just a blank acceptance of whatever was to come. One of my colleagues rested a hand on my shoulder, a wordless gesture of solidarity. The house, once eerily quiet, now stood as a scene steeped in violence, marked by the evidence that would tell the tale in court. But it wasn't over for me. The image of the woman's limp body and the glint of eyes under the bed would replay in my mind, etching itself deeper each time I closed my eyes, haunting the silence that followed me home. The rest of the night unraveled in a blur of paperwork, relentless questions, and statements that had to be perfect down to the last detail. Every second of that call, from the knock on the door to the flash of ambulance lights, was picked apart and documented. The station buzzed with activity, the clatter of keyboards and the hum of voices filling the air. The man, who we soon learned was her boyfriend, sat cuffed and silent in the interrogation room, offering nothing but terse responses. The motive behind the attack surfaced quickly: betrayal. He'd found out she had been unfaithful with a close friend, and his rage boiled over into violence. Despite the 6 deep wounds she bore, she survived. Knowing she'd pulled through was a rare glimmer of relief in an otherwise dark night. But even with the case wrapped up, the echoes of that night followed me home. The memory would replay without warning. The sharp creak that made my breath catch, the cold, unblinking stare under the bed, the suffocating silence afterward. They'd creep back into my mind, uninvited, in the quiet moments between shifts. I'd jolt awake at night, the image of his eyes, the emptiness in them, burning behind my own closed lids. The feeling of the room, the sharp scent of blood, the sound of distant sirens, all of it etched so deeply that it felt like I was still there. It's hard to explain how a moment can shift everything, turning routine into a memory that gnaws at the edges of your peace. It alters you, reshapes the way you move through the world, how you react to the smallest noises or glances over your shoulder. The job had its risks. I knew that. But facing danger so closely, feeling the chill of a near miss, it's different. It stays with you in the most mundane of moments, lurking like a shadow. Even now, when I drive past quiet houses on patrol, I feel that chill, the hairs on my neck bristling. I scan the windows, half expecting to see a flicker of movement, a silhouette in the dark. The truth is, life moved forward, but I never fully moved past it. That night marked me, left a scar no amount of routine could ever quite erase. During my 25 years as a highway patrol officer, I thought I'd seen everything. High-risk encounters, horrific accidents, heart-pounding chases. I'd been through it all. But there was one night that still haunts me. It was around 4:30 in the morning, the road so quiet that the silence seemed to pulse around me. I was part of the cop show back then, and Joe, my assigned cameraman, was in the passenger seat. He was easygoing, knew how to stay out of the way while capturing everything. But nothing could have prepared us for what was waiting that morning. The highway was lined with derelict buildings, relics of a forgotten era that always seemed to draw trouble. One in particular, an abandoned gas station, had a way of unsettling me. As its entrance loomed, instinct kicked in. Joe shifted slightly, camera ready, as I steered into the lot. That's when I saw it, a beam of light cutting through the dark inside the station. My chest tightened, and the air grew heavy, pressing against me as if in warning. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence roared in my ears. Something felt wrong. Usually, break-ins meant a getaway car, some sign of activity. But the lot was empty, blanketed in darkness, save for the now motionless flashlight beam inside. I took the loudspeaker, my voice steady but hard. "This is the police. Come out with your hands up." The moment the words echoed back, the light inside blinked out, swallowing the interior in an even deeper black. The quiet that followed seemed to freeze everything. I glanced at Joe. He met my eyes, camera still rolling. His silence spoke volumes. With a flashlight in one hand, I moved toward the gaping entrance. The stench hit me first. Rank, putrid, like meat rotting under a blazing sun. I pushed down the urge to gag and stepped inside, the beam of my light darting across broken shelves, strewn papers, and debris. "Police!" I called, my voice cutting through the thick, stale air. Nothing. Then, from one of the back rooms, came a sound that made my blood turn cold. A muffled, dragging noise. A chill raced down my spine. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, as if something heavy was being moved, each scrape whispering of effort and dread. I forced a breath and took another step forward, the crunch of debris beneath my boots louder than ever. The light from my flashlight trembled as I aimed it toward the back room. Dark stains smeared across the floor, and disordered footprints disrupted the thick layer of dust. The hairs on my neck prickled. The sensation of being watched was so intense it was almost tangible, Each step I took reverberated through the hollow space, my pulse hammering in my ears. The silence around me wasn't just quiet. It was charged, waiting, holding its breath along with me. When I finally reached the entrance to the room, a silhouette stood motionless in the shadows. Time seemed to stretch unbearably as I aimed my flashlight at the figure. Before I could react, it turned sharply and bolted toward the back exit. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the silence. I rushed forward, my pulse thundering in my ears, but as soon as I crossed the doorway, all I found was darkness and the rustle of tall cornstalks whispering in the night breeze. Whoever it was had vanished, as if the field itself had swallowed them whole. Breathless, I stood there, eyes scanning the dark sea of stalks for any sign of movement. Frustration clawed at my chest. Pursuing them further was pointless. They were gone. Turning back, I caught sight of Joe, still at the entrance, the camera in his hands shaking slightly. His eyes, wide and searching, reflected the same question racing through my mind. What just happened? The rotten stench seemed stronger as I re-entered the station, the tension coiling tighter around me. We moved cautiously deeper inside, drawn by the mystery that now loomed over the place. When my flashlight fell on the corner where the figure had stood, I froze. The beam illuminated a human body, shrouded in dust and darkness, decayed beyond recognition. It was grotesque, limbs twisted in unnatural angles, the flesh discolored and shriveled with age. Joe's camera trembled as he captured the scene, and I could feel the edges of reality beginning to blur. Nothing about this made sense. This wasn't a recent death. My hands quivered as I reached for my radio, forcing my voice to stay steady. "This is Officer Daniels, requesting immediate backup at the old gas station on Route 17. Possible deceased body found. Over." The words felt hollow as I spoke them, the reality settling like a stone in my stomach. The body's state made it impossible to tell if it was male or female, but one thing was certain. It had been there for a long time. What I couldn't shake was the question, who was here, lurking in the dark, only to run when I called out? Joe, who had remained composed through countless tense situations, stepped back, eyes darting as if trying to grasp the gravity of what lay before us. The silence that filled the room was suffocating, as if the entire building was bracing itself for what would come next. Every small noise, a creak, a snap, had my heart hammering in my chest. My nerves stretched thin. When the sound of sirens finally broke the suffocating quiet, I felt both relief and apprehension. Help was coming, but so were the questions, the investigation, and the endless speculation that would follow. I kept my eyes on the body, wondering who they had been, and what story had ended so brutally in this forgotten place. The wail of the sirens grew louder, their approach slicing through the darkness and signaling that this night was far from over. The other officers arrived swiftly, their voices cutting through the heavy silence with urgent practice commands. They moved like a well-oiled machine, securing the area, their flashlights slicing through the dark as they assessed the scene. Quick, sharp questions followed, and I recounted everything. The shadowed figure, the chase, the unsettling discovery. Despite my years on the job, I felt an unfamiliar sense of helplessness, as if I were trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. Cameras flashed, capturing the grotesque scene, every detail immortalized under harsh light. The investigators combed through the building, boots crunching over broken glass and debris. But after hours of work, they reached the same conclusion I had feared. The victim's identity was untraceable on the spot, and the figure I had chased into the night had left nothing behind but questions. The early light of dawn crept into the sky, pale and indifferent. I was cleared to leave, the exhaustion settling into my bones like a weight. Joe stood nearby, camera down at his side, eyes hollow with the kind of fatigue that seeped beyond physical. The footage he captured never aired. It was deemed too unsettling, too unresolved, an echo of something that no one could explain. Weeks passed, and the case grew colder, buried beneath layers of more pressing concerns and unsolved mysteries. But the memory refused to fade. Whenever I drove down that stretch of highway, a chill would slither up my spine, my gaze flicking to the abandoned gas station that now loomed like a dark sentinel. I would remember the sudden beam of that flashlight, the suffocating silence that had followed, and the shadow that had bolted into the unknown. The sense of incompletion gnawed at me, the unanswered questions haunting the quiet moments. Who had that body belonged to? Why had someone been there, slipping away like a phantom when confronted? It felt as though the night had opened a door to something I was never meant to understand, only to slam it shut just as abruptly, leaving me stranded in the threshold of an unfinished story. Even now, years later, I feel the weight of that night pressing against the back of my mind, a lingering reminder that some stories don't come with resolutions. They start and end without warning, leaving behind an ache of unknowing that never quite goes away. I was 17, and during that time, my mom's job kept her traveling frequently, leaving just me and my dad at home most nights. He was a police officer, with eyes that seemed weighed down by years of long shifts and stress. Yet, he always carved out moments for us, like our regular dinners at the local diner. On a clear night, with the moon bright against the sky, we decided to visit our spot. It was around 7:30 p.m. when we left. He still wore his slightly crumpled uniform, the creases a testament to a long day, but his posture unwavering. The ride back was calm, the streets thinning out as the night deepened. Soft chatter from the radio mixed with my recount of a soccer game at school, a trivial detail that seemed all important at that age. But then I noticed it, a subtle shift. My dad's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and his gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, sharp and calculating. Our conversation halted, the air inside the car suddenly dense. I glanced at him, puzzled. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice small in the growing silence. He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the mirror. After a beat, he spoke in a low, measured tone. "There's a car behind us. It's been following us since we left the diner." The words made my chest tighten. I turned to look. A black sedan, headlights dim, trailing too close for comfort. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, a pulse of unease creeping over me. "Hold on," my dad said, calmer but firmer. He turned onto a dimly lit street, then another, watching for the sedan's reaction. It followed. The turns, each one mirrored. The unease solidified into fear as the headlights behind us blazed brighter, an aggressive roar of the engine shattering the quiet. "Grab the phone," my dad ordered, his voice clipped, "from the glove compartment. Call my colleague." My hands fumbled, shaking so badly that the phone nearly slipped as I tried to dial. When the line connected, the voice on the other end was casual, oblivious. My dad interrupted, his words quick and steely, summarizing the situation in a tone that silenced everything else. A pause, filled with static and muffled voices, the crackle of a police radio. The tires beneath us screeched as my dad navigated sharp turns, the force pressing me against the seat. The sedan's high beams flooded the car with an unbearable light, erasing the darkness and stealing our sense of direction. "Read the street names," my dad barked. I squinted at the signs flying past, calling them out through a voice quivering with fear. "Turn right, then go straight for 2 blocks. We're on our way," came the voice on the line. Urgent now. A lifeline in the chaos. My dad didn't hesitate, the car surging forward as the world outside blurred into streaks of shadow and light. We did exactly that. The street lights blurred into streaks as we sped past, their glow bending in our peripheral vision. My dad took the last corner sharply, and the tires screeched, sending a shiver down my spine. To our left, an almost empty supermarket parking lot loomed, its cracked asphalt bathed in pale overhead lights. "Pull in there," the voice on the phone commanded, more urgent now. Without hesitation, my dad jerked the wheel, and we skidded into the lot, the sedan shadowing our every move. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch. The headlights behind us flared, illuminating the interior of the car in stark, blinding light. Then, as if from nowhere, the wail of sirens erupted around us, piercing and sharp. Red and blue lights flashed in a chaotic dance, casting elongated, jagged shadows across the lot. Police cars swept in like a synchronized wave, cutting off the sedan's path. My dad leaped out of the car, moving with a precision I hadn't seen before, racing toward the officers as they spilled from their vehicles, weapons drawn. Commands were shouted, firm and clipped, mingling with the metallic thud of car doors slamming and the snap of handcuffs locking. I sat motionless, ears ringing with the rush of adrenaline, eyes fixed on the sedan now surrounded by agents. Minutes passed like hours. The chaos in front of me blurred as my mind tried to catch up. When my dad returned, his face was tight, lined with exhaustion, but edged with relief. He slid into the driver's seat, buckled up, and steered the car out of the lot, the motion almost gentle now. I turned in my seat, catching one last glimpse of the 3 men, young and defiant, pressed against the sedan, with their hands cuffed behind them. Officers flanked them, their expressions unreadable. The ride home was silent, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. The darkened streets felt unfamiliar, their shadows deeper, as though the world had changed while we weren't looking. Every small detail, the creak of the dashboard, the old smell of leather, seemed amplified, etched into my senses. My dad broke the silence with a sigh, his voice low and strained. "I've been part of a special unit, anti-drug operations." He paused, eyes locked on the road as if facing down an unseen threat. "I've kept it quiet, but sometimes missions come back to haunt you. Tonight was one of those times." A lump formed in my throat as the reality of his words sank in. The chase hadn't been random. It was retribution. My pulse thudded in my ears, the last of the adrenaline draining from my body. I listened, every word carving a new understanding of the man I thought I knew and the danger he lived with. The streets blurred into a patchwork of light and shadow. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of home felt altered. The glow from the windows casting restless shapes. My dad turned off the engine, the silence between us heavy, almost suffocating. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Tonight, you saw something you weren't meant to see." The weight of his words settled into my chest, cold and unyielding. In that moment, the world I knew shifted, leaving me with the stark truth. Life was more fragile, more complex than I'd ever understood. In the days that followed, my dad became a man on edge. Each night, he'd check the locks on the doors and windows, not once, but several times, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. The faint click of locks turning became a new bedtime ritual, punctuated by the subtle hum of security cameras he installed around the house. The red recording lights blinked like watchful eyes, casting a sense of vigilance over our home. I noticed the way his posture stiffened whenever the phone rang, especially if the number was unfamiliar, or when he lingered by the window, tracking the movement of cars passing by. He tried to keep things as they were, joking during dinner or asking about school, but the mask was thin. The haunted glint in his eyes betrayed the change. I, too, felt the shift. Sleep became a battle, every creak in the night a trigger, every flash of memory replaying the chase, the roar of sirens, the blinding glare of headlights. The night seemed longer, more restless. A few weeks later, my dad put in for a transfer, requesting a position in a unit with less risk, further from the shadows that had begun to creep into our lives. The shift brought a fragile sense of safety, but silence settled between us like an unwelcome guest. We never spoke about that night. The few times I tried, broaching the memory cautiously, he would tense, finding an excuse to leave the room or change the subject with a forced smile. Even now, the echo of that night remains. The shrill cry of sirens in the distance makes my pulse quicken. The sight of a black car trailing too close sends a chill racing down my spine. The feeling of being watched, an unease that clings like a shadow, has never completely left me. That night marked me in ways I still can't put into words. A silent reminder that safety is a fragile illusion, one that can shatter without warning.